You know, I wish I had this tutorial back in the day when I was a beginner, back when I had that gleam in my eye, because I remember I would go to YouTube and type something in like wooden procedural material tutorial, or maybe like wooden plank tutorial, and everything that would show up, literally every result, was garbage. It was just telling you to take a wave texture and distort it, and it did not look like wood, and especially if you looked for these plank tutorials, they would also be garbage. So this video is going to be a homage, or really just kind of like the tutorial I wish I had back in the day, to appease like past version of myself. If I got in the time machine and went back to when I didn't know what I was doing, I'm sure that this would be useful. So consider this the best wooden plank procedural tutorial on YouTube. We'll see if that pans out. So what I'm going to be teaching you how to make, of course, is a procedural wooden plank material. You could also get rid of the planks and just make this raw wood, and some of the sliders that I'm going to, show you how to make, all the mathematics behind it, and all this is the amount of tiling. So again, all procedural, no matter what tiling size you have, it will work. So again, number of tiles. We're going to talk about darkening, so you could have all of them be the same, or some of them be darkened or whatever. It turns out I typed in smoothness twice for this. I think this smoothness should actually be offset. So you can see here we have a consistent pattern. We're going to talk about how to randomly offset each of these rows by a different amount. So it's kind of like you're randomly placing down tiles. Then we have smoothness. So as we crank this up, it kind of becomes like a slippery floor, or we could do or we could do kind of like a rough wooden thing. So that controls that. And then finally, we're also going to talk about bump. In other words, how much the light catches the wood and all of that. So again, this smoothness just talks about the design. So here we have kind of like very straight lines, whereas the bump is just talking about like lighting properties and all that. So overall, not too many nodes. We'll try to do our best to show you what's going on here. Hopefully this turns out to be the best wooden plank tutorial on the internet. Okay, to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a plane. The reason I do this is because normally you kind of apply this material to a floor, so it's nice to visualize it, on a plane instead of a sphere. The sphere is usually the last part because it works with any object with a UV map. What I'm doing right here is I'm just setting up the scene. Before we do any like node material stuff, I just like to switch to cycles to get, more realistic lighting results. HDRI, or really the background, set it to transparent, so that when we incorporate our HDRI lighting, we don't want the light, but HDRI lighting, we don't actually see it in the background. Now, if you don't really know what I'm doing right here, not a big deal. None of this is actually important to making the wooden plank material. All this is just for the lighting setup and making it look good. Don't worry about it. This is where the actual tutorial begins. So, step one of this, of course, is make a material. I'm going to call this wooden planks. And I guess we should save this as Untitled. I already tried doing a take of this, but I ran into a technical difficulty. Don't worry. This is a true one-take tutorial. I wouldn't lie to you. What we want to do is turn this into wooden planks, which, we might have to do a lot of math to make those like little planks that are offsetted and all this. But if you think about it, we know that Blender, and this is just a nice little trick to get us going. Remember that Blender has a brick texture, and bricks are pretty much the same thing as wooden planks, except they're a bit like thinner. Point is, start with a brick texture, and what we're going to do is kind of manipulate this until it's looking more like our plank design. First thing we can do, turn down the scale just so that we have less of these at once. And again, this thing's already procedural, so anything we do to it should keep that proceduralism and seamlessness and all that. So just to start off with, what we want to do is decrease, I can't remember, I think it's this frequency. Point is, we want to stretch it, and if we have this set to 2, we get some like very strange results. So make sure the bottom frequency is set to 1. These are all just parameters of the brick texture, and then slide this up until you have kind of like the length or the dimensions aspect ratio that you want your planks to be. Next thing is we're going to take our mortar size. That's going to be this black separator. In other words, what's separating our planks. Take this and let's like divide it by 2 so it's half as thin, and that is looking good. So already, without too much work, if we wanted something with kind of constant offsets, which, we could change the number this is, but it's just going to be constant regardless. If that's what we want, this is a perfectly fine start. Now, of course, this isn't what we want. We want random offset and all that. So let's take this brick texture and make some of these rows dispersed, or I guess shifted down. To do this, what we need to do is, first of all, add in a texture coordinate system. So for example, we're going to be using UV coordinates because that works with any object with a UV map. best not to use something like generated or object coordinates in a scenario like this. What we're going to do is we're going to take this and separate it by x, y, z components. And what we want to do is take this y component going vertically, in other words, defining like which row we're going to be on. We want to take this, and for each row, we want to generate, in some sense, a random number that tells us how much to offset it by. Pretty simple stuff. So, first of all, one thing you're going to notice is when the scale is set to 2, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows, right? When we have 3, we should have 12 rows, etc. Point is, whatever number we have here, we have 4 times as many rows. And you could look into the brick texture to see why that is, but quite frankly, don't care. That's just the case. So when we have 1, we have 4. When we have 2, we have 8, etc. The reason that's important is what we want to do is separate this y value into 8 discrete and distinct values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this y gradient going from 0 to 1, bottom to top, 0 to 1. We're going to take this and multiply it by 8, or I guess 8 if this is 2, but to make it kind of more procedural and less defined or less restricted is probably a better way to put it, is we're going to use a parameter, a value node to pick a scale. And then also what we could do is add in another math node, set this one to multiply by 4, because again, that's the rule of taking scale multiplied by 4 to get the number of rows. Meaning that if we have 3, we're going to have 12, which is going to work here, etc. Okay, so now we have a gradient going from 0 to whatever number this is times 4. We take this, and then we want to generate a couple numbers. So quick way to do this, take this and kind of round up to each value. This isn't a great way to see what's going on here, but let me just explain. Here we have the number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., because we have the 0 to 8 gradient, and it's rounding up to the nearest integer. So we have 8 values. If this was set to 1, we'd only have 4 bands, etc. Okay? Take this. We can use these discrete values that are now distinct for each row and use a white noise texture, which will, kind of what it does is for every input, it generates a random 0 to 1 output. In other words, now we have a nice map where every one of these bars has some kind of offset value between 0 and 1, which is cool because if we take our brick texture, which again has constant offset, use this vector texture coordinate input and mess with it, then we have the result that we want. Okay, so in theory, non-theory, in practice, what should we be doing here? Well, we're going to make a combine XYZ, in other words, a coordinate system for this. Right now it's going to mess everything up because now we've plugged in a single vector for this. What we want to do for this is for y-axis, we're going to keep this constant. So again, we're using the y-axis from the UV coordinates. And for the x-axis, I guess we can use this manipulated one over here, which right now is going to make, not the result we want. And that's because we we exactly set the x values to be discrete, right? So there's no gradient or variation. So final thing you need to do, add this to the original x. So again, what's happening here is we're taking our y component from UV coordinates, bringing it over. Nothing changes. With x, we take it and then just add these random numbers, which now gives us random offsets, right? And the way this works is if we add a multiply right here, so this is kind of like the component of the white noise before it gets added. When this is set to 0, in other words, it has a, voice cracks awful. It's always best to acknowledge these things. When this thing has a strength of 0, has constant offset, but then as we increase it, it randomizes it quite a bit. So for now, we can just kind of get rid of this and assume that we're multiplying it by 1. Okay, cool. Again, nice thing about this is that we now have this nice system that we can increase this number to whatever we want because we have this multiply by 4 equation, and then we have this procedural kind of offset situation. And this is kind of like how I made the tile slider from before, okay? So this is a good start. By the way, if you don't like the randomness that it generated, you could make this 4-dimensional white noise and then pick seeds for different kinds of offsets, but whatever. I'm going to keep the seed at 0. But that's another slider I guess I should have added in. Okay, cool. So now we have kind of like the base pattern for our tiles, or I guess our planks. But currently these could just be rectangles, they could be bricks, they could be whatever. So let's make these specifically wood. And this is kind of like the part of the tutorial that matches a couple of the other ones. But hopefully we kind of make it look a bit more real than those other guys. So currently we have these planks going along the x-axis. So in some sense along the y-axis, but going from left to right is the way you want to think about it. If we look at this wave texture, we want to set it to Y. Again, you'd probably think it's X, but don't worry about it. It's kind of like perpendicular to what you think it'd be. You take a wave texture, and again, what we want to make is the wooden grain here. And the trick that everybody seems to know for this is you take distortion, bring it up just to add a bit of distortion. We then crank the detail to make it like, look a bit more, I guess detailed is a good word for it. Crank up the detail, crank up the roughness as well, and this is a good way to, kind of start off your wood texture. Right now it's looking more like, tree bark, but we are going to manipulate the initial coordinates coming in. Also, we can make it more dense by adding in more scale or more lines is another way to think about it. A way to make this look more like wood that some tutorials talk about, some of them don't. I wouldn't recommend listening to the ones that don't. To make it look better, take another wave texture, and we're going to manipulate this to use it as the texture coordinates. And I guess it's probably better to use one with default settings for now. What we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to use the UV coordinates for the texture coordinates for this, because again, ideally, at the end of this, we just have one coordinate system, so they're all branching off UV coordinates. For example, or it could be generated, whatever. We take this, we're going to plug it in right here, which is heavily going to mess up our thing. First of all, make sure it's going the right direction. We kind of want this, but not to this extreme amount. This is kind of like perfectly smooth, sanded, perfectly elongated wood. It's not what we want. What we want to do is we want to take this and we want to mix it together with our initial coordinates. Not by much, just by a little. So we're going to mix this with our UV coordinates. So again, the way you want to think about it is we have UV coordinates that are being used for the wave texture, and then we're mixing it with the original coordinate system, meaning if we set this to 1, it's going to give us wave texture, and otherwise it's just going to give us some UV coordinates, okay? So what we want to do is just kind of crank this down a little, and you're going to notice that, the more we do this, the more it's going to distort. So I'm going to crank this down a little, like I just said, and then to make this look more like wood, we need to mess with the second wave texture here. So I think we want this to be a big number, so you can see this gives us our nice banding. Also, you can add in a second wave of distortion, although this tends to get a bit chaotic if you go too high, so just a tiny, tiny bit. You could also crank up the detail, stuff like that. And you can see this is what we had before, and then just with a bit of distortion, we get something that looks a lot better. And you can also play with this value and make it its own slider, but this is a good way to get kind of like, handmade probably isn't the right word for this, but what I'm trying to say is the floor that's under you right now, it kind of has this uniformity to it that doesn't feel quite natural. So this kind of gives it that uniformity where again, before, after. Okay, cool. So we want to take this and use this as our base wood, and then we incorporate the planks and all this. How do we do it? Well, since we've started creating all these masks, etc., it's just about time that we used a BSDF, in this case a principled BSDF, so we get lighting reactions and all that interactivity. What we want to do here is first of all mess with the color, so I'm taking this modified wave texture, and I'm going to plug it into base color, and then just to make it, wooden colors, use a color ramp. Wherever we have black, we're going to make it some kind of like reddish, some kind of wooden color, and then for the white, you pick a different type of wood. And this is all dependent on the thing it is that you want to make, right? Some wood looks very black, some of it doesn't, whatever. You just play with it until it looks right. And speaking of playing with it until it looks right, I'm just going to be messing with these values a bit more until I get more of the look I want, because right now it's looking a bit cardboardy. I'm thinking we increase this a bit, just so we have a bit more distortion, and we also make this a bit more detailed. That's looking a lot better. Okay, so this is kind of like a perfectly, flat wooden floor and all this. Okay, so we've picked two colors, and now we want to incorporate our wooden planks. There's a couple ways you can do this, but probably the fastest way is we're going to throw in a mix RGB. So we've already done our color ramping, and now we're going to send this to another, color operation or color process. The way you want to do this is multiply it by, well, I guess we could either mix or multiply. I'm going to take the factor, because the factor is the one that has, black, and black where there's the tiles, or I guess I should start saying planks, and then white everywhere else, whereas the color kind of has this variation. We are going to take this and connect it, take this and connect it as our factor, which is going to give us this, and I guess we want this bottom one to be black. There we go. In other words, we're multiplying the initial color with black only wherever there is mortar, which is white in this original mask. Otherwise, it's going to multiply by 0 in the middle. Okay, so now we have our wooden plank separation. Another thing that makes this look super realistic is having a bit of variation. Even if you think your wooden floor has perfectly identical planks, it's probably not the case, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to do another multiplication, but this time I think we can use just this output right here. I'm going to bring this down to black just so we have a bit more variation, and let's see if this works. If not, we can add in another brick texture. So I want to use this as the factor, and you can see that this does exactly what it's supposed to. And we can also control the intensity of this, so math, multiply. When it's 0, it's multiplying by 0, so nothing happens. Let me also clamp. And then as we go up to 1, we get a lot more variation, right? The reason this works, again, is because we have variation built into the brick texture. They've already coded this in, and yeah, you could do it yourself with math nodes. Wouldn't recommend it. Just use the pre-built-in thing. Why not? Okay. So now we have a good amount of variation. One more thing that will make this look super real is right now we kind of have a BSDF where with a bunch of settings, but really all this is color information, right? There's not too much difference between this and this. What we want to do to make this look more realistic is add some kind of depth, not in the sense of displacement, but in the sense of bump mapping, just to give it that light interactivity. And we could mess with all these nodes and get a new kind of mask for this, or and this is what I would recommend, we could be super lazy. So everything that we've done to get to the base color, we're just going to take this, use it as a height map, and connect that to our normal. Again, what the bump node does is it converts height information, whatever map we input. It converts it into normal information, which you can see kind of looks like wooden normals. Oh, the burps are coming. But you can see very quickly this gives us the correct result. One thing you might need to play with if you do something a bit differently over here is you might need to invert it depending on whether these things are going inwards or outwards. And sometimes it's kind of hard to tell. But now we have kind of a floor that reacts to lighting conditions. The lower this is, the smoother the floor is going to be. But you definitely want some kind of number larger than 0. Okay? And of course, it's possible to overdo it. But for now, this is going to be fine. Okay? Next thing I want to talk about is roughness. We're not going to do too much with this, but again, roughness is how shiny the surface is going to be. This is perfectly rough, so it's not going to be reflecting much light. Whereas when we bring this down, it's going to get closer and closer to a mirror from the right angle. I guess this would be a good angle to show what's going on. What we want to do is just keep this at a certain value, but have the mortar, the black in between the planks, have a roughness of 1. So it's not reflecting anything, and that would just make it look a lot more real. Ideally, the burp came out, thank God. Ideally, we have the roughness also kind of mapped to this thing the same way we did it to the bump, but of course I'm lazy and it doesn't look too bad if you just set it to constant values, okay? To do this, what we're going to do is we are again going to extract the mortar. We are going to use a color ramp, so again, black is going to be the interior, it's going to be the planks, and white is going to be everything else. For the planks, we want a roughness that's pretty close to 1, but still somewhat reflective, so let's do 0.7. So now we've modified the planks. And then for the white, which is going to be the mortar, we want a roughness that is perfectly 1, so that's already good. In fact, we could probably lower the plank part to something like 0.65, just so it's a bit shiny, and you could use this as your own parameter as well in your node group. Take this, connect it to roughness, see what that gives us. You can see now this is shiny, except, in fact, too shiny. We'll fix it. But you can see it's shiny except for the lines in between, which is exactly what we want. So again, if you want to affect the initial shininess, or not the initial, the plank shininess, you can take this and bring it up. Or if you don't want to do it in the color ramp, a nice trick is after you do this, and this is good if you want to make it a parameter, math, addition, set it to clamp so it doesn't go above 1. And the more we add here, the rougher, or really the higher the slider is going to be brought up. This one's going to be held constant since we're clamping, but this one's going to be brought up. So 0.2 should make it like super rough. and then like 0.5 should be basically no reflection, etc. But this is before and after. Maybe even 0.3 should be fine. Okay, cool. So now we have the base setup over here. Let's see what controls we have so far. So far, we have kind of like the master slider over here for tile size, and it works because it's all based off this brick texture, which is controlled by this value node. So it's going to work with the offset and everything, because the white noise will keep working, etc. And the darkening values are going to be controlled, again, by the brick texture. Another parameter that you might want to be able to control is the reason we had this multiply, I believe, was for the darkness variation. So let's just add a slider for that. Set it to 1, bring it over here. And it's always good to give these things names. We'll be a bit lazy this time. So this is dark. This is tiles. And again, you could really get in here and control like detail and stuff like that, which is the quality of the wood inside here. And maybe it's a good idea to make it a bit smaller, just so it looks like there's more grain going on in here. You could control these things, but generally, I don't like messing with too many of these. Maybe we'd want to control for this one because it really changes the look of stuff. You could get a super, I didn't want to keyframe that. You could get a super smooth looking wood, or you could get one with quite a bit of coarseness. I'm going to bring this down a bit. All that's up to you, but for now, I'm thinking the main 3 important parameters are the texture coordinate setup, so in this case, UV coordinates, the number of tiles, and the, wow, the voice cracks are coming in. They're coming in hot today. Whatever, can't be embarrassed by it. I'm making the best tutorial ever for wooden planks. Some other stuff we can control, again, is the offsets and how powerful that's going to be, etc. But for now, these 3 sliders are going to be enough. So once you're happy with that, Control G for the rest of this. Move that over, move these over. And then, of course, we could always modify these. But I wanted to show you how I got that initial sphere in the beginning. I just added in a sphere, subdivided, Control 2 to do that, quickly. We take this, we apply the same material, and the reason this is going to work, at least kind of work, we'll talk about why it isn't working exactly, but the reason this pretty much works is, again, it's going to be using the UV map, which every object, at least primitive, comes with inherently. So, always scares me. I wonder if you could hear that miss thing. I always comment on it. Every object comes with a UV map. You can see this actually alters it because, again, it's based on that. The reason there's this seam down the middle is because there's a seam from here to here. So even though the pattern goes across, maybe the darkening doesn't, because the brick texture, I guess, isn't inherently compatible with seams. So make sure your object has a seamless UV map, or otherwise, just look at the other side of this. The reason this looks weird, other than the seam, is because it's going horizontally instead of vertically, but we have a quick solution for that. Either vector rotator, I guess mapping node would probably be cleaner. We're going to use a mapping node. We're going to rotate this by 90, like that. And again, you probably saw we could do any value in between and get this nice wrapping. That's the nice thing about proceduralism. So we're going to rotate it, and then we are going to, I guess you could either scale it like this, or again, we have this nice tile slider. So let's set it to like 4, or no, that's not enough. Let's set it to 8. That helps. And then also let's stretch the UV map on the y-axis. Not by that much, but just by a bit, just so it looks a bit better. So again, this is the initial setup. You might want to mess with lighting and stuff like that, with your bump, with your darkening, etc. But you can see this is kind of like the essence of how you make the, this is the essence of how you make the wooden materials. I think I've done a good job. Pretty much the rest of this is connecting more parameters, as you can see over here. Nothing special. I made the lighting setup look a lot better, which is why, this looks better. You can see we have these area lights, etc. But what did we not have? We didn't have the initial, or we didn't have the offset, which the way we do that is I just controlled the multiplication of the white noise before it reaches the combined texture coordinates. Smoothness was just the mixing factor between the first wave texture and the UV coordinates. So you remember we did that trick, and then the bump is just the control on the bump node, if I can find it right here. So essentially it's the same thing. Anyways, if you want to get this original blend file with all the settings, and it's also like packaged nicely and everything, I'm going to rename this, but that is going to be available on Patreon. Patrons get access to all blend files that I make. So this and all the others are going to be on there. exclusive tutorials that I'm going to start, ramping up again. I was busy with November, but I got sidetracked. So now I need to start making more exclusive tutorials. You also get Discord access behind the scenes, and sometimes I make Patreon newsletters, which are pretty cool. But really, I want to thank all the 550 some patrons, which is quite a few. That's actually a lot. Who are supporting the default Cuban CG Matter channels. You are keeping this thing afloat, and hopefully this wooden plank tutorial makes up for it all. I really think it's a useful material, and hopefully you can get a lot of use out of it. Nice thing about this is not only can we rotate, but vector math, you can just slide this and get an infinite amount of tiles. I think that's all I have to say about wooden planks. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you now understand how to do this, and the Blender noobs, and especially me from the beginning who was looking for this tutorial, can finally be at rest.